Hello, and welcome to our video response series to the post-pandemic Future of Homeschooling conference hosted by Harvard Kennedy School. If you haven't seen them already, there are 5 other videos in this series, and you can watch them on YouTube or Facebook or the website HomeschoolFreedom.com. You can also search Homeschool Freedom in social media. So there's still going to be one more week after this one, so be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you're sure to be able to follow future videos. My name is Stephanie Lambert, and I am the Executive Director of the Texas Homeschool Coalition. My parents homeschooled my siblings and me in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, and our organization, THSC, has been serving homeschool families in Texas since 1986. So I am here today along with 3 other state and national leaders as a part of HomeschoolFreedom.com. And HomeschoolFreedom.com is a project of the Alliance, which is a network of Christian homeschool organizations across the country and across Canada. So joining me today are Gerald Huebner with Global Home Education Exchange, Roger Smith with both Homeschool Louisiana and the Alliance, and Sherry Seligson, who is a curriculum author for Apologia Educational Ministries. So today we're going to have a roundtable discussion to talk about this week's discussion, week 6 of the Harvard event. So the topic today was what trends in homeschooling are occurring internationally, and is homeschooling an international movement? But before we get into the topics or the questions, I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, talk about their work within the homeschool community and how they've been able to interact with and have exposure to homeschooled children themselves. And Gerald, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Stephanie. And it's great to be here together with you. I really enjoyed the Harvard workshop today and looking forward to the last one coming up next week. Apparently they've got a panel of homeschool parents that's going to be part of that, and I'm really looking forward to hearing them. I've been involved together with Bev, my wife, in home education since the early 80s when we started with our 2 children, which we went all the way through. We were involved and have continued to be involved in leadership in Manitoba, which is in the center of Canada, in the Manitoba Association of Christian Homeschools, as well as I serve as the chairman of the board of HSLDA Canada. So it's been a privilege to be involved, and we've been thrilled to be able to say yes to travel to a number of places and interact with home educators. And so looking forward to our discussion today, talking about this thing called international home education. And I would say unquestionably, it has become a movement, and I'm looking forward to chatting about that.
Great, thanks. Sherry, we'll go to you next.
Okay, I have, my husband and I have 4 kids. We homeschooled our kids kindergarten through 12th grade. Before that, I worked as a marine biologist at Walt Disney World and loved science. And in the homeschool community, when you get pegged as a scientist, everybody wants to teach their kids. So I, many years through that time, did co-op classes and was part of co-ops teaching science and working with students, started writing curriculum for Apologia, science curriculum in particular. And now that our kids are grown and out of college, and I continue in the homeschool movement, supporting homeschoolers, encouraging students. I travel internationally and throughout the US, speaking to both students and parents about homeschooling and get to encourage them. Actually went back and got my master's in education because I wanted to learn more about this whole education thing. So wanted to be a lifelong learner like my children.
Awesome. And Roger?
I am a practicing physician in a small town in Louisiana, and we likewise had 4 children and home educated them from the get-go, and they're all thriving. We're now enjoying the grandparent years, and we're up to 6. So 3 boys, 3 girls, and so it's lots of fun. But we've been involved with homeschool leadership on every level, the local community, the regional, our state organization, Louisiana, and now we're involved with the national alliance group that, works to help state leaders be successful. And it's been a pleasure to get to know Gerald and be involved in some of his projects internationally. So
It's very clear from all the introductions that we, all of you have a lot of experience, decades really, of experience in the homeschool community in your own states and across the nation and across the world. So this is going to be a good discussion, I can already tell. All right, so what I think we should start with is, let's start with a title question. And Gerald, I'll give this one to you to start with. Is homeschooling an international movement, and what trends are we seeing in homeschooling internationally?
I think it is, Stephanie. I think homeschooling is a movement, but I think we should define what a movement is. I think a movement is some activity, some groundswell, some organized something whereby people get together and other people recognize it. And I think that it's not a very scholarly definition, but that's what I would describe this as. And as I've been involved in this international thing since 2010, when a group of us got together in Chicago and said, what could we do outside of North America to be able to encourage homeschool freedom? Because we were concerned about the attacks that were happening on parents, and where governments and agencies were saying, no, you can't do that. And we were saying, that's not right. And we basically, to some degree, called a group of people that were interested in working with other people together and said, can we do something together? And that group has grown. We had a conference in 2012 in Berlin, 2016 in Brazil, 2018 in Russia. And that's just one conference, but I think it's been a stimulus to encouraging people to do things in their own country, whether that be countries like Germany, where there's major oppression, or France, or countries that are off the beaten track, like Ukraine, or the United Arab Emirates, or Japan, or a whole lot of places. And what we've seen in the time since 2012 is that we've seen growth in countries in phenomenal ways. And that has caused people to become aware, and for governments to pick up their heads and say, what is this thing? And for researchers to study us, because we are a thing, and people are interested in researching things. And that's what we heard about today in the Harvard workshop, that they are interested in looking at us. So are we a movement? Without question. Are we a small movement? Yes. But some would say we're a dangerous movement, and it makes things interesting.
I'd like to jump in briefly, if I may. I was unaware of the movement internationally until I went to one of your conferences, and it was rather eye-opening to me to see the wide variety of countries that have a groundswell, albeit small. But even the presenters today talked about they were doubling numbers within just 2 to 4 years. And so you can say that is movement, so the numbers might be small still, but they're doubling in a very short period of time. And that is movement.
That's true. So I think a good question as we get going is, and something that was discussed today a lot, was unschooling. So Sherry, I wanted to pass off to you. Could you talk to us about what is homeschooling? If we're going to say, is homeschooling growing? What is homeschooling? What is unschooling, which was discussed a lot today? And what is the difference between homeschooling, unschooling, and what a lot of people have been introduced to, which is public school at home?
It's an important question, because it's good for people to know if homeschooling is growing, what are the people, what are they doing? And like Daryl, with the kind of a broad definition, I can't give you a solid definition for unschooling. Homeschooling is educating your children at home using the best method possible for each child so they can reach their greatest potential. Now, if you have 10 families that unschool, for example, you're going to get 10 different types of home education, even within unschooling. Unschooling is a very non-traditional approach where you're not necessarily using curriculum, you're kind of going day by day, and even though there may be plans of what's going to be done, it's sometimes student-led where the students have an interest and you go in that direction. It involves unit studies. Sometimes it's using eclectic different things for different subjects, and really living life and learning through that process of living, which we heard the folks who did the research in Israel, they had a lot of that experiential living, and we always learn every day, every one of us. And so that kind of is unschooling. But then you're going to have some who do unschooling and they have math curriculum, or they do unschooling and they have, and so there's various types, but all of those go under the guise of homeschooling in that it's primarily parent directed, and the students have the freedom to choose, the parents have the freedom to choose curricula or plans of education that fit their needs, which is differentiation. When you're educating at home, or your kids are learning school at home via Zoom or whatever, which is public school, then they've got an instructor who plans the curriculum, does the education, does the testing, and the parents really have no say, no part of that. And that is not necessarily, and really in a large scale, I would say not homeschooling. So when we heard people comment during the workshop that I tried homeschooling for a year and it was a disaster. Well, I want to know what was it they tried, because frankly, having to do what parents had to do during the pandemic, where their kids were learning from a teacher, distance learning, and the parents had no clue what was happening, that's not homeschool. That's harder than homeschooling. I at least knew what my kids were learning and got to be a part of that and learn with them. And so I have every concern and I admire what parents had to do in that situation, but I wouldn't necessarily call that homeschooling. So I really want to make sure that we understand that when we talk about the growth of the homeschool movement.
Great, that's really helpful. So a lot of the people watching this probably are going to be in North America, and they're going to be having homeschooled or themselves or homeschooling their kids. So a question that I want to throw out there maybe to Gerald would be, why does this matter? Why does this conversation matter? How does it affect the average family at home across North America?
Well, I think it affects us from the perspective that we live in a lot smaller world than we might think. And the things that happen in other countries, in other places, are being picked up by the media on a global basis. And there are those that think this thing of home education, of parents teaching their children, is not the best thing. And anything that threatens that in another country threatens us, whether it be in Canada or US and other countries. And I think the great things that happen in other places also testify to the reality that this thing works, and it works well. So when we see that, for example, in the Russian Federation, that home education is booming, that the Russian government is openly recognizing the right of parents to choose and direct the education of their children, that the Russian Orthodox Church is getting behind that and saying this is a good thing for the family and for the country of Russia. We may have philosophical and political differences, but I think that those things, as they happen in other places, or the National Homeschool Day that's declared and celebrated in the Philippines, those kinds of things all affect us, whether it be here in Canada or in the United States, and they build or threaten the freedoms that we enjoy. And so they're important for us to be able to support our fellow homeschool parents in other places and encourage them and work together.
It's important to be aware of these trends because eventually they are going to affect us personally if they aren't already doing that. So Roger, something that I'll go ahead and get you to unmute, something that I heard them talking about was, especially, I think they talked in Israel about how they were wanting to talk to the kids, and they were wanting to find out how the adolescents felt about homeschooling. And I actually thought to myself, I don't think I've ever heard people wondering too much about what adolescents are thinking about things right now, trying to go to them as experts. But what are your thoughts, Roger, on who should we be listening to they were talking about, they did survey the parents some and other educators
Right.
and students. So what are your thoughts on who we should be listening to, who they are listening to?
The opinions of everyone involved does have some validity, and putting it in proper perspective is so important. And so I thought that the questions that they asked the students were so insightful and helpful, although, the study's still quite small. They're just really getting started with this. And the questions of like, what is learning? Even just, that definition. I thought that was great. We didn't get to delve into what the responses were. What is learning? What do you learn? How do you learn? When do you learn? Why do you learn? It gets back to that, the question I guess we should start with is, why do we learn? So getting, that question should be asked to not just the students, but also the parents. And because our motivation does matter. And they address that in a lot of different ways of saying, there are a lot of different reasons that people are drawn to home education. And those do help sustain us if we have good reasons for doing it in adverse situations. And so we see that diversity of motivations in North America. Ours may not be as culturally different as the different countries we see, but the questions of why are we even doing this, those questions are very important.
Yeah, as a homeschool alumni myself, my perspective of my own homeschool journey changed as I got older, and I appreciated it more and more as I gained more life experience. So I think it's important to talk to children, but also they only have a limited experience that they're going to be basing their thoughts on at that time. I think another great group to talk to would be more alumni. So you heard them talk about talking to unschooled alumni, but you didn't hear them really talking to other people about the outcomes of homeschooling. So I think that would be a good group to talk to as well.
Yeah. And we should listen. We should, so we should, try to get that information and really what does that tell us? Mm-hmm. And how can we move forward in a positive way? So. Right.
So I don't know if Gerald, you want to take this, or Roger, but an interesting thing when we're thinking about homeschooling and we're thinking internationally, so much even in the US it varies state to state, not to mention country to country, how different cultures can be. So how would you say that various cultures define and evaluate home education or even education itself differently from each other?
I think there's a number of cultural drivers that come into play. And the one that I'm most familiar with, and it's not specific to education, but it talks about what are some of the base motivation. And for example, in North America, we live in a honor-based culture where we want to we want to be guilt. We don't want to do things wrong. We want to be complying with the law. We want to be doing those things, and in that way, it's really a guilt or innocence based, where we strive to fulfill the law, and when we're not fulfilling the law, we're nervous. We're wondering about what's going to happen to us. In much of the Slavic and Eastern countries, they live in an honor and shame based culture where they're striving to retain honor and avoid shame. And the guilt innocence doesn't play there. In a lot of the Asian and African countries, it's a fear and power based culture where they're driven by those things. And so the base drivers, don't have time to get into it, are very different. And the motivations for complying, not complying, objecting, how we object, and how we educate are driven by those basic cultural differences. And there's other models, but that's one of them that I think means that, for someone to to try to get a good education. If they're based on an honor-based culture or a fear-based culture, the drivers are very different in terms of what their education plan and approach is going to look like.
It was stated that homeschooling is that we should take an intellectually humble approach to it because it's so varied. It's really hard to define in some ways, especially as you're talking about even in different cultures. What is education? Education is going to really look a lot different across cultures. Sherry, you are a curriculum author and a teacher yourself, and you've been a student yourself. What would you say about the ability for people to access curriculum internationally? And is that changing?
I think it is. I think that there has become more and more access from the individuals that I talk with, especially the English-speaking countries throughout the world globally. They have access to a majority of the materials that are here in the States. So, for example, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, a lot of the other countries that utilize English as a second language regularly as well will utilize the same curricula that we have here or have access to it. Those that do not, or those that want obviously to have it in their first language, their initial language, there are translations of English curricula, and then there are more and more curriculum companies and writers wanting to produce curriculum that meet, as Gerald was saying, the cultural heart of that country or region that will benefit what their goal is. Because, academic success may be the standard in some places, and I would certainly say in the secular society in the US, that's probably success in education. But academic success is not always success in education, both here and around the world. And so I think it's growing. As the conversations like these are happening, we're going to get the what ifs and how do we, and the innovators who say, well, I'm just going to make what I have. And my question then, as I'm saying this, is perhaps that's why we have seen in the Israeli study that a lot of that was unschooling, because there may not be a lot of available curriculum for these families that are homeschooling there. I don't know. That's a question to ask, but it certainly can be done without official curriculum. But the more that's available, it's growing, because where there's a need, people will provide that. And so I'm seeing that. I'm seeing translations and requests coming more and more too.
That's exciting. One of the things discussed was the public perception of homeschooling. One of the panelists was asked about that, and he mentioned that governments seem to be a little bit more negative toward it, and in the media there seems to be some more positivity toward it. Roger, would you want to speak to that at all? What is your thought on the worldwide public perception of homeschooling?
Yeah, and the guy that made that what you're referring to is the Frenchman, and I there was one little snippet that he made that I thought was so important, and he talked about in the media that is positive, and he said the parent groups have worked hard at getting that positive perception, and it just kind of was almost lost in the conversation. But that's one thing that we have sought to do in North America, is to work very hard to have homeschoolers seen in a positive light. And because we've all traveled this road as well, and that, homeschoolers are weird, no one knew anyone, but now everyone knows a home educated student or a home educating family, and have some perspective for it. And so they're working hard to try to get seen by their neighbors, by the media, as being valid. And so, whereas those who are unfamiliar are much more negative. And that's what we've seen in the past here. And so they're just years behind in the journey, but it does take work to move from the negative public perception to that positive. And so it's interesting to see them struggling up the hill.
Mm-hmm. Gerald, there was a lot of discussion about various regulation, especially in Quebec, of homeschooling. What would your comments be on whether there's research that shows that homeschool regulation impacts the outcomes of homeschool students?
Well, there certainly has been research, Stephanie, that looks at comparing places that have various levels of regulatory regimes on home education, and that research has been very, very clear in that there is no better outcome with more regulation, despite the fact that that government would naturally think that if they exert themselves and if they try really hard, they could make things better. And I guess that having been a civil servant, not in education, but in agricultural science for over 40 years, that's a natural reaction in government. They look for solutions that they can apply. And the challenge is that this is really out of their hands because it's in the hands of parents. And the more that governments can be encouraged to keep their hands out of it, the better. And that's not a natural reaction, but it has been fascinating during this pandemic to see governments in a number of places coming to homeschool organizations and saying, could you help us help these parents that are struggling with this home learning? We know it's different, but you guys have experience. Could you help? And so I take that as being a very significant shift in perception, at least in some places. And I think something that we can continue to offer that help because we're not through this yet.
I would like to tag on that just a second. And I think that's one area that Sherry probably is a stronger writer for curriculum in that she's lived it. And just like we talked about the cultural mindset of people in a different country, they might take a North American curriculum and they try to just translate it. Someone has to give it the cultural spin. And so to put it into perspective of the people, the way they're thinking. And so, it made me think of Sherry as lived it, now producing for other people. And then, what that means for the international community is that now they have to, as the movement develops over there, they will develop their own writers and not just translators. So
that's good. Well, before we wrap up, I would just like to ask each of you, what have your overall impressions of this Harvard event been so far? There's going to be one more week to go, but do you believe it's been a positive discussion? And what do you think the overall impact of it will be? Roger, we'll start with you.
Well, it's been surprisingly pleasant. And what has really struck me is that there are people that are outside the homeschool community that are actually objectively watching and they don't seem to have an agenda, just like Dr. Peterson, he is kind of directing this orchestra of presenters, and he was talking about the most well-known unschooler, Peter the Great, and he's made reference to other people, even Horace Mann. He was talking about him being a homeschooler, and I thought that it was very interesting that they really have been observing, and that there are researchers all over that are trying to get a handle on what is this thing that's been developing over the last 40 years in North America and now going around the globe. And I think it's been a very positive thing to see that there is real research, real inquisition to try to understand what's going on. And we can benefit from that.
Great. Sherry, how about you?
I would agree, Roger. I think that the fact that we're having these conversations on the scale that are being had right now is encouraging. I think it's been positive for the most part. It's starting the dialogue in a way that is, I guess another word, I can't think of another word for positive. I need a thesaurus. But it's a positive discussion. It's rather than as homeschoolers, at least my experience, starting back when homeschooling was practically unheard of, whether it was legal or not, and whether we were ruining our children. And now we've got studies and examples, anecdotal as well as research studies that support that this is a viable educational mode, and to educate the families who are interested what this is. That's what I think is also good, because it takes a commitment. You know, the I forget which one of the ones said, I guess it was the French study that said 1 to 2 years and people stop homeschooling. Well, that's because it's a big parent commitment. And a lot of times there's that struggle working out of the home, in the home. How do you deal with juggling all the plates? And we need to educate families how to home educate, and so that's where I hope the dialogue will continue, so that they're going into it with their eyes open and committed that it's indeed a commitment, but the benefits are phenomenal. And so I'm hoping, and I'm encouraged throughout all of these conversations.
Great, and we'll finish out with you, Gerald.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. I am thrilled with the tone and the scope of what the Harvard Research Review workshops have been doing. It's really a continuation of what we've been doing in the Global Home Education Exchange research, which happens on a monthly basis. And to me, going back to our first question, are we a movement? I think we're a movement when we have researchers that want to poke and prod and study and learn. And we're seeing that happen. And some of them are positive, some of them are ambivalent, some of them are negative, but that means that it's objective. And then we can hold our heads high and know that we're being looked at. One of the closing things that I want to reference is a presentation that was made by Dr. Paula Rothermel. And Roger, you've met Paula. She's from the UK, and she did a review of all of the research that says home education works. We all know that, we've seen it. But she said, why? Why does home education work? What's the underlying reason why it works? And she said she looked at a huge amount of research, and she came up with a term and a presentation that said the home education works for one reason, and that is because parents love their children. And it's not the way that a scientist would usually describe it, but most homeschoolers would say, well, duh, like that's for sure. But it was real, and it's true. And if there's one thing that I'd like to leave everyone with is, what can you do? What you can do is you can share that reason. You can share that joy. You can share that opportunity that you've had as a family, not about the curriculum, because people will use different curriculums and different methods, but how can families share together? How can they pour the love into their children and experience the joy of learning together? And if there's something that I think families across North America can share with people around the world, is not, you should do it like me, but you should love your children and you should pour yourself into them. And if there's something that people can do, they can be doing that.
And who better to ensure a quality education than a loving parent? You know, there's no stronger advocate. Well, I want to thank each of you panelists for being a part of today's discussion. And for the viewers, if you want to continue this conversation, we encourage you to join the Homeschool Freedom discussion group on Facebook. We'll be back next week, and we hope you'll join us as we continue the conversation about the Harvard conference as they tackle the next topic, which is parents' experiences with homeschooling and what it's like to homeschool, and has COVID-19 changed the homeschool experience. Thank you all.